Well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming along. For those of you who've been here already, I much admire your patience and your resilience, because this has been something of a whistle-stop tour of a very long period of time and an extremely large range of space. We're about 4,000 years into our journey of how the classics were made classic, but we'll have a rather more gentle lecture today, insofar as we're only covering 1,000 years. Just like last time, it's only 1,000 years today, broadly speaking, from the 5th century AD through to the 15th century. And that journey is going to develop where we've got to in the tale. We've learned about the emergence of writing, the emergence of literature, the emergence of a sense of a shared literary written culture, and we ended last time with the technological development of moving from the papyrus scroll to the parchment codex, which, as I tried to put it across to you, was a really important moment in terms of what survives. Now, it should seem that once we're at the stage of literature having got into a parchment codex, which, as I say, can survive for thousands of years, so the copies we have go back to the 5th century, but could last another few thousand years without problem, it should seem as though the work is done. Whatever texts were transitioned from papyrus into parchment codex can survive, and therefore they are what we have as the classics. Now, although it's true that there's some sense of continuity in this process, what I hope to put across today is actually it's much more complex and much more random than anyone would have us believe. By that, I mean it is true that figures in authority could use power to determine which texts had preference. That's true. However, that is so often interrupted and so often overturned that it is not, in any sense, a simple tale of continuity. Similarly, we could look at the 4th century and we could say, okay, here we are in Western Europe. It becomes Christianized under Constantine, and by the end of the 4th century, Christianity is the state religion of Europe. Therefore, it's simply going to be the case that in Christian Europe, the Christians will preserve the texts and we will have what they had. Again, it's part of the truth, but it's much more complex than that. So just to recap a few moments where power has loomed in our tale will be a good place to start. So if you recall, we saw in the 6th century that the tyrant of Athens, Pisistratus, could demand that there be an official copy of Homer, instantiated in written form, and that was put away. Homer locked down. In the 4th century, we saw something analogous in Athens with Lycurgus, another so-called tyrant, who locked down the official forms of the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and so on. In the century after, we saw major state developments in the post-Alexandrian kingdoms. In the Ptolemaic kingdom, the Library of Alexandria was created. And I didn't talk about that at great length, but I hope I put across the fact that two really important things happened at that point. Number one, there was an attempt to gather together stuff worth knowing, okay? And that's not as simple as saying, hey, let's get all the books. It's actually an element of curation, of drawing a line between what is literature and what is simply written words, bringing them into a single institution, and actually setting about ordering them, the ordering of knowledge. No one had ever done it before a library, because you're only faced with the problem of what knowledge goes where when it's manifested in physical form. So in the Library of Alexandria, we have this amazing figure called Callimachus. And Callimachus, although not head librarian, devoted his life to sorting out the books of the library. And we don't know how many books there were, but in terms of scrolls, probably somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000. Huge amount of books, an amount that is unsurpassed until the 19th century. No one anywhere in the world has that many scrolls, that many books for 2 millennia. Well, Callimachus writes the first library catalogue. And again, it's not a case of simply listing everything you have. It's a case of working out what relates to what and what belongs where. And he wrote a 120-book catalogue, the Pinakes, the tablets. And it doesn't survive, ironically. The account of what was in that library is one of the great lost texts for us, but it does show the first step in trying to impose a sense of order on the chaotic history of what has been written. Okay, you'll remember there was the rival attempt up with the Attalids to set up their library at Pergamum. Again, it's an attempt to impose a sense of order upon the books of the ancient world. We moved finally from Greece to Rome, given the Roman conquest of Greece, and you'll remember some snapshots where power mattered. Sulla, the dictator of Rome, Sulla, brought the library of Aristotle, which was in a depleted state, to Rome. It was a physical case of a powerful figure dragging and dropping what was regarded as meaningful knowledge. Now, as you may know, when we get to the end of the 1st century BC, so the 30s and the 20s BC, we move from the Roman Republic to the Imperial period, when emperors, despite saying we're just equals among everyone, became the dominant single figures, okay? And it's true that the Imperial period for the next 500 years was able to wield power that shaped the books we have. But it's only true in a small sense. What do I mean? Well, an imperial figure such as Augustus could, if he so desired, exile an author from his realm. This most famously happened under Augustus with Ovid, the great love elegist and epic poet with the Metamorphoses. Ovid did something wrong, partly by writing a poem about how to seduce women, and in the final book, how women can seduce men, but also a mysterious error, some mistake, we don't know, but he's sent to the farthest flung shores of the Black Sea, and effectively there's a damnatio memoria. He's wiped out. Ovid doesn't count. Now, good for Ovid, his books survive, but it's possible for an imperial figure to draw a line through someone's name and blacklist them. This continues to be true. Tiberius exiles people. Nero forces Seneca and Lucan and Petronius to commit suicide. He enforces the suicide of those literary figures because they've got on the wrong side of him. Their works survive, thankfully, but we are in a realm of imperial top-down control of what literature should be doing the rounds. It gets worse. If we get to the end of the 1st century AD, Domitian, he's reputed in one case to have been so offended by a work of literature that he executed not only the author, but also the bookseller from where it could be obtained, and the scribe who had made those manuscript books which had got into circulation. So it'd be easy for us to step back and say, wow, everything changes in the imperial period. The emperors start to control what is worth knowing. Unfortunately, that simple tale is not at all true. The reality is that public libraries emerge in the 1st century BC, and they grow in the Roman world all the way through to the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. And these public libraries are open to citizens, and their collections are openly curated, okay? So it genuinely is true that whatever your political opinions, whatever your stance on Christianity until the 5th century, you could go down to the library and read what you want. Okay, well, this raises a question that must be doing the rounds in some of your minds, which is, well, who is in charge when we get to the 5th century? And it comes down to the crucial question of books surviving the fall of Rome. Who's in charge? Is it the last Roman emperor, little 11-year-old Romulus Augustulus, a poor and pathetic little figure who's deposed by the invasion of the Ostrogoths? No, Romulus has got no say whatsoever. Is it the aristocratic families who own the most important libraries in the 5th century who somehow steer which books survive the fall of Rome? Not really, no. The answer, and this is really important for us to understand in this lecture series, is that no one is in charge. Okay, so for what follows, I'm going to sketch the history of Latin literature with the infusion of Greek literature over the next 1,000 years. And it's a much more complex and interesting tale, I believe, than perhaps one might think. Okay, to set the scene, we can take a remarkable figure called Boethius. And Boethius is a really useful person to zone in on because of what he stands for, and because he's the last person really to stand for that. So what's the story with Boethius? He's a Roman, but he's born after the fall of Rome in 476, a few years later. He's adopted by one of the great aristocratic families of the day, and indeed one of the great book collectors of the day, the Symmachus family. They raise him up, he becomes hugely educated. Perhaps he goes to Athens or to Alexandria to learn his Greek, because he's without a doubt the best speaker of Greek, best reader of Greek, in the Western Empire by the early 500s. And Boethius has a mission. He's a Christian, as pretty much everyone is by the 6th century. He has a mission to somehow fuse together the so-called pagan tradition of Greek and Latin classics with the patristic tradition of the church fathers in the Christian world, to meld them together. A lot of Christians had banged their heads against the wall, realizing that it's so hard to do that really you've got to give up the classics if you want to follow God properly, okay? Huge anguished debates in Augustine or Jerome about that particular problem. But in the case of Boethius, he regards Plato and Aristotle as philosophical figures who had an intuition of what Christianity was going to be. They were humans, they were made in the image of God for Boethius, so their literature was not pagan and separate, it was actually proto-Christian. Now, that is so-called Neoplatonism, a new form of Platonism that melds with Christianity. But the important point is that for Boethius, his job, as he saw it, was to tell the world that keeping alive the Latin and Greek classics was an essential part of being a good Christian. But what happens to him? Boethius, despite translating lots of Aristotle into Latin and thereby preserving Aristotle in Western Europe, he's imprisoned on the assumption that he's too close to the Greek Empire in the East, and he's executed. In 524 or 525 AD, the young Boethius is killed. And this is such a symbolic moment because when Boethius dies, and I don't want this to sound too romantic or simplistic, but it is true. When Boethius is killed by Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths, that kills the survival of Greek knowledge in Western Europe. And that's significant, not because knowing Greek is a good thing, but because, as I said last time, every single Roman author is fundamentally committed to the truth that they are always looking back over their shoulder to the Greeks. You cannot understand Latin literature without knowing Greek. Okay. So the lifeblood of Greek is cut off at this point. And Greece is going to crop up at a few points in what I have to say, but let's move over to the Eastern Empire briefly. Because I've said rather loosely and freely that the Roman Empire falls in 476. That's only true if we gloss that as being the Western Roman Empire. That falls in 476. In the East, over in Constantinople, the eastern side of the Roman imperial tradition still has legs in it, and boy does it have legs. It's got another millennium. It lasts until 1453, which is fundamentally 1,000 years later. And you might think, okay, well, that's the Greek world, speaking Greek, orthodox religion, it's a different thing. Well, what did the Eastern Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, style itself as and call themselves for that 1,000-year period? Answer, Romans. Okay? So the Romans did survive in the East, but that is a Greek-speaking world. It's really important for the Western Empire for the simple reason that in an unbroken tradition for 1,000 years, Christian texts are read in Greek, but also pagan Greek literature survives. It's enjoyed, it's copied, and it stays safe. However, it is very rare over this 1,000-year period that all of that wealth of Greek knowledge gets into the bloodstream of the Western Empire, which deals in Latin. Okay, so a few things to round off the Greek Empire. Justinian, that great emperor, great in terms of his stature, in the 6th century, Justinian, is said to have closed in 529 AD the Academy at Athens. That's important because although the Academy of Plato had risen and fallen at different times, it really was the lifeblood of the philosophical tradition in the ancient world. A decree by Justinian effectively closes business there, and academia ends. Now, just as a tangent, what does it mean for someone to say, I'm an academic? Well, it all comes back to this place, academia. What's that about? You may know those lines of Milton in Paradise Regained. See there the olive grove of academe, Plato's retirement, where the Attic bird trills her thick warbled notes the summer long. Okay. Tangentially, academia is named after someone called Academus, who was a Greek hero who allegedly defended Athens when Helen of Troy had been abducted there. There was then a grove sacred to this Academus. Plato set up his proto-university in that space, and academia came to mean serious scholarly research. So it's a kind of interesting tangent. So the pagan tradition of learning is shut down by the Christian Justinian in the 6th century, and we enter a narrow, more orthodox-focused tradition in the Greek East. Okay, let's go back to the West. Where are we? We're in the 6th century. Almost no one in the Western Empire knows Greek. Yes, there are Greek books in those great libraries I mentioned, but no one can read them and no one can write Greek, so those books simply get destroyed. They're gone. It may seem then that the next 1,000 years are going to be rooted simply to keeping alive the Latin text that we have. And that's largely true, but then it begs the question, well, we say they're being preserved. Who is preserving Latin literature in the 6th century? Why? We've got these invading German tribes, your Visigoths, your Ostrogoths, your Vandals, your Lombards, your Franks, all setting up different parts of kingdoms around the old empire. Well, they are not invested in Latin literature. Now, to be clear, they're not trying to overthrow Roman culture. It's not a case of the barbarians are here, let's destroy the Roman world. It's a case of elegant and sometimes inelegant adaptation. But that adaptation does not include keeping alive the torch, the flame of the Latin literary tradition. It's simply not a concern to be writing literature or to be reading literature. And we spoke last time about counterfactuals. It really doesn't take many twists and turns to be tweaked in this period of history for Latin literature to die. How would it die? Well, no one would write it because there's no obvious purpose to write it. And the books would be destroyed, not because parchment can't survive, but because parchment will only survive if it's kept dry, if it's kept looked after, and damp and flood and fire and neglect don't come into play. So, we get to the answer. What in the 6th century kept Latin literature alive, kept the culture of the classics going in the Western Empire? The answer is Christianity, but in an indirect route. These various kings I've mentioned were either Christian when they arrived or quickly became Christian. But it's no longer a state top-down interest to preserve these books. Instead, in an era that is often called the Dark Ages, and I think in relative terms we can say it lacks literary light, so it's somewhat dark in that regard, it was individuals who had stepped away from society who kept alive the important tasks of not just reading, but crucially writing and copying Latin literature. And I refer here to monks, to the monastic tradition. Now, monk ultimately comes from Greek monachos, someone who lives alone. And yes, in the early days of Christianity, in various parts of the Mediterranean world and the Levant, individuals said, screw it, I'm out, I'm going solo, and this will be my life as a hermit, fine. But that's not very helpful for the circulation, the preservation of literature. Ipso facto, you've shut off yourself from the world. But we do start to get from the 4th century AD, especially in North Africa and in Egypt and Sinai, the emergence of a collective culture of individuals who communally retreat from society. And it's crucial to those people, in a religion all about scripture, to write, to read, to share written texts. And from that point, we get the emergence of some really important institutions. The oldest monastery currently surviving is St. Catherine's on Sinai, and that's founded in 529 AD. And by chance, that same year, 529, is when, on the Italian mainland, we have Benedict of Nursia found his own monastery in what we call Monte Cassino. And Monte Cassino is a major player in the survival of Latin literature. Now, in the case of Benedict, it's not simply pointing to someone who set up a monastery and all was fine. No, it's the fact that in the Benedictine rule, the regula benedicti, the rules by which you're meant to live in this community, a core part of the day was given over to lectio, which is the Latin for reading. Well, it doesn't take much thought to put together the demand that you read for certain hours alone in the day with the fact that you're going to have something in your hands to read. So indirectly, the Benedictine rule stimulates a monastic culture of book production. I mentioned last time that books became really expensive in a technological change that was a step forward and a step back. The step forward was that the codex is just a much better thing to have in your hands, but the step back was that it costs, I'm just making up numbers here, but 50, 100 times more to make a codex out of animal skin than it does a roll out of papyrus. So it becomes a really elite product, and for much of the medieval period, a well-produced book is worth more than a village in terms of its fiscal value in the economy. So monasteries are able, as they gradually gain in influence, gain in land and gain in wealth, to produce exactly the sort of parchment codices that allow for the survival of literature. It could have been the case that another figure who sets up a monastery soon after, Cassiodorus, could have changed the world in an even bigger way. This Cassiodorus figure sets up a monastery near Squillace in Italy called the Vivarium, the place that's alive. And he is adamant about how important it is that monks train in the art of writing, the art of book production, and really grow that wealth which had been so winnowed and narrowed by the collapse of the empire. As it happens, Cassiodorus' monastery doesn't last for much more than a century. But he writes a work, the Institutiones, the institutions, which tell serious monks around the world, you've got to make books. Okay. Well, this sets the tone for the next few centuries, but it's more complex than we might think. It's not Italians getting sort of on board with the idea of producing books, going over the Alps and into Europe, founding monasteries and making more books. Could be that, but it's not that. Instead, rather strangely, we have to go way out west to Ireland. And Ireland is extremely interesting as a counterfactual of sorts, because that island was never under the Roman Empire. The Romans, as you know, got towards South Scotland, all of northern England, much of Wales, but for whatever reason, Hibernia, Ireland, was never on the cards. But when Christianity came into the Roman-ruled Britain, Christians independently converted Ireland, whose culture was in no sense Romanized. And for reasons we don't understand, because we don't have the records, by the time the Romans leave Britain in 410, Ireland is already a cauldron building not just a Christian culture, but a culture that regards writing as an extremely sacred act. And what's more, the Greek-speaking Romans had somehow got in Ireland. So if you pause the tape at 550 AD, and you say, okay, who in Western Europe knows Greek? No one is raising their hand except some people in Ireland, pretty much. And by virtue of that, for the next 200 years, the intellectual traditions of Western Europe are fed from Ireland. From Ireland, not just St. Patrick and his snakes, I mean figures like Columba, found in the Christian tradition on Iona and converting Scotland and northern England. Columbanus, who's a different figure, goes to Europe and founds monasteries, getting down all the way to Italy. And that tradition continues for the next 200 years. A bookish, learned culture from Ireland feeds in through the kingdoms of Proto-England and ends up being picked up on the continent as scholars worth listening to. So let's get ourselves to about 800. We've had major figures that you will have heard of, such as Bede, the Venerable Bede. You might have heard of Alcuin of York or Aldhelm of Malmesbury. But these guys are not just clever individuals in 7th century England. They, despite for the most part not travelling even out of their county, they had got locked into an emerging culture of book circulation. So, if we look at England, you may know that 597 is this canonical year when Augustine, this is a different Augustine, was sent to convert England to Christianity and set up in Canterbury. And you may know that 70 years after that, in 668, the Pope said, look, we need to sort out England. It's getting too messy. And he sends two people. He sends Theodore of Tarsus, who's from the Greek world, he's Byzantine in our terms, and he sends a chap called Hadrian from North Africa. And these two have the job of not just Christianizing, but Romanizing England. I'm not going to get into the world of Christian dogma, that's not relevant to my tale. But what's really relevant is that when these people come, they bring books. They bring Latin books and some Greek books, and they invite English monks to travel to Rome. And if we go back to Bede, where's Bede? Bede at the age of 7 is oblated, that is to say, offered as an orphan to the monastery of Monk Wearmouth. He never travels. He goes to Lindisfarne maybe, to Jarrow, but he's going nowhere. He's stuck near Sunderland in modern terms. And yet, Bede becomes one of the most learned figures in the whole European world because a friend of his called Benedict Biscop goes to Rome 5 or 6 times and brings him books. And England is being fed at this point by a moving intellectual tradition of physical knowledge. And for that reason, Bede is the first English historian. He's the first serious figure to think about chronology and how we are where we are. And he's the first serious commentator on the Bible. So books become the movement of intellectual culture, not people. Okay, if we get ourselves to 800, there's a figure that you will all have heard of. Big Karl de Grosser, Charlemagne. Okay, we're in the Carolingian era. And for 2 reasons, Charlemagne's really important. First, despite the fact that he couldn't write, and we debate the question of whether he could even read, he was at the head of a huge empire, becoming king of the Franks, king of the Lombards, and then uniting Western Europe, with the exception of Spain and obviously the British Isles. It's a new Roman Empire. And indeed, on Christmas Day, 800, Charlemagne goes to Rome, and the Pope crowns him as the Roman Emperor. Not the Holy Roman Emperor, even though this is the Holy Roman Empire. No, he is a new Imperator Romanus, a new figure. He's conquered Rome, and he's going to keep that tradition alive. Well, in practical terms, this is a massive amount of land, and he needs to be able to control it. And for that, 2 things are necessary. 1, he needs to train up people who can read and write Latin, write it to a credible degree, and write it in a form that you can read. Now, you might say, okay, it's not hard to write legible Latin. Well, let me tell you, if you look at some of these manuscripts from the 8th century before Charlemagne gets involved, they are wild in terms of what the script looks like. I mean, crabbed, dense, chaotic. It takes years of training for a modern expert to be able to read them with ease. And those were the official documents. So Charlemagne, despite his own intellectual shortcomings, gets very serious about setting up schools that will teach reading and writing and take books seriously. The second part of it is that by virtue of conceiving of himself as an emperor of the Romans, he's serious about the history of Rome. So Christianity's there, but he's also extremely concerned about preserving the Roman classics which were there before Christianity. And to give you some rough numbers, under Charlemagne, the creation of books in the broader area of, let's say, modern France, Western Germany, and northern Italy increases tenfold in 50 years and 20-fold in the 50 years after that. Put differently, before 750 AD, we have about 500 manuscripts from Gaul and this sort of area. In the next 150 years, 750 to 900, we have 7,000, okay? So there's a huge uptick in book production and in literacy. And that's why we call this the Carolingian Renaissance. When we use that term, we're strictly speaking about the re-emergence of a literary culture. But that's exactly what I'm here to talk about. Okay, so we've got to the 9th century under Charlemagne. Unfortunately, like with all the best laid plans, the Carolingian Empire falls apart within a century. And the sort of linear progress that some of our contemporaries might feel we're always on, it's always getting better, is not true at all in Western Europe. The 10th century and the 11th century are fractious times, things go backwards, book production decreases, and it looks as though there may be a future where all of that great creation of Carolingian manuscripts, most of which are our oldest versions of all Roman authors, our oldest copies are from the days of Charlemagne, it looks as though that could actually go up in smoke. So, how is it then that in the 2nd millennium AD, from roughly 1000 to where we are now, the classics and Latin literature survives down to us? Well, the answer actually is not with Charlemagne and with these new kings, nor is it with the monasteries. Now, I've left the monasteries behind for a bit, and they've just been doing their thing. They live by their own rules, whether it be Benedictine or Cluniac or Carthusian, whatever it is. But they still are only able to treat the classics as playing second fiddle. Remember, books are unbelievably important to make. You've got to kill 50 to 100 calves or sheep or goats and then stretch their skin, prepare everything, spend months writing them. A really luxury product. So you're not going to focus on creating pagan texts when the Word of God is literally what it's all about. So they do preserve and copy a lot of these texts, but they do so in a way where it's only by piggybacking on the Christian tradition that the classics survive. The biggest of these libraries only had hundreds of volumes. So there's no library, to my knowledge, before we get into the late medieval period, that could point to more than 1,000 books on the shelf. That's a very small amount. So the reality is, when we say, okay, how much literature has survived of the ancient world, the Greeks and the Romans? The answer is we don't know, but no one has ever said more than 10% survives. So put differently, somewhere between 90% and 99% plus has been lost. With the Library of Alexandria, we just don't know what happened. But again, there's no real evidence that the holdings of the Library of Alexandria went somewhere else. Instead, they appear to have been destroyed by various factors. In Rome, by the time of Rome's fall, we had 28 public libraries. Where did their collections go? Where did the great aristocratic collections go? Again, we don't know. No such library survives. And all we can guess is that when we see a medieval library having a rare text, somehow someone salvaged it, and it then got copied within the monastic institution. So, as we get into the 2nd millennium AD, it's true that there are lots of classical texts sprinkled around dozens of monasteries in Europe. But no one's in charge. No one's controlling what's going on. A monk can make a catalogue of what's in his library, or a nun can make an account of her own, and we might correspond and exchange a book, make a copy and return it. But this is tiny in terms of the effect it has on the broader literary populace. So what changes? The answer is that in the 11th century, in Italy, a new culture emerges. And this is the university. Now, the university is something that both comes out of nowhere and continues a long-standing tradition. By that I mean this. Before the 11th century, there's nothing we can point to in Europe that you could call a university, i.e., a place where anyone can come and for a certain amount of money learn things that are regarded as important and then get some sort of permit to teach elsewhere. That's what a university is. That doesn't exist. The closest thing we have is in Italy, in Salerno. There's a very famous medical school that probably goes back to the 800s. But it's just medicine and it stays medical. You could call that vocational almost, rather than a university. But in the 11th century, things suddenly change, and there's two reasons. I don't want to list popes after popes after popes, but Pope Gregory VII, in the late 11th century, reforms all sorts of things going on in the Christian world. And one of the things he's very serious about is education and sorting out the schools. Because, of course, there are schools. Monasteries had schools for the young boys who entered them. And cathedrals had schools attached to them from their earliest days. So there are schools, but it's not, therefore, the case that these schools are going to thrive intellectually. For Gregory, they have to. So there's a reform of the educational sector, and suddenly a text is discovered in Pisa that everyone had forgotten about. What's this? This is Justinian's Digest, one of the great legal texts, which is a game changer when it comes to understanding how the legal system works. And so in the late 11th century, specifically in Bologna, there's a new movement of people outside the monasteries who want to get serious in learning about civil law and canon law, the law of the church. New texts are available, and so scholars start banding together in order to learn. And that word universitas, which gives us university, is not what you might think. It doesn't mean a university is where knowledge is universal and we learn about everything. No. Universitas means a collective gathering, a group, a guild, as it were. And the fact is that the university emerges as students gathering together and demanding their rights, demanding that they're not going to be overcharged for accommodation, they're not going to be overcharged for books. If a lecturer is rubbish, they should be able to get rid of that lecturer because he's no good. And that is the birth of the university, 1088 in Bologna. Now, what's really interesting, at least to me, from this point, is that when that first body of individuals talk about themselves as being an intellectual block, their way of conceiving of things changes as other universities are formed from them. So in the next 50 years, all sorts of universities crop up. We've got Padua and Naples in the 1220s. Up in Paris, we've got a university going by 1200. Here in Oxford, there's a university of some kind going by the 12th century, some point in the 1100s. And in Cambridge, where I'm based, a university's active by 1209 at the latest. But in all of those cases, it's a linear development from Bologna. International students came there, they liked what they saw, they went back, set up their own, they then fell out, left Paris for Oxford, they then fall out, kill someone, Oxford goes to Cambridge, and there's this tradition of linearity in the early university. Okay, that's important because it's wrong to say Europe changes. In the 12th, 13th century, everyone suddenly had this enlightened moment, let's get together and learn. No, it is a continuum. But in the northern world, in northern Europe, the university, the universitas, is not scholars, it's masters. So if you look at the history of the university, southern Europe and northern Europe are very different. In southern European universities, The kids have the power. The students are in charge. But in the North, generally speaking, it's the academics, the masters, who control who can teach and who can't, and what students can and can't do. It's quite an interesting divide. Okay then, we've got the university on the page. Things are looking good in Western Europe. What are people learning? Well, from the days of Boethius and Cassiodorus, we have a conception of the 7 so-called liberal arts. But rather strangely, those 7 arts are divided up in a way that seems to us a little counterintuitive. You've got your block of 3 subjects, the linguistic trivium, grammar, so you know how to read Latin, rhetoric, so you know how to deploy language, and dialectic or logic, so you understand, the technicalities of what will and won't work. So you've got your trivium. You then go up to 4 subjects of the quadrivium, which is mathematical. And this is based upon arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Music was conceived of as mathematical. And only then, having gone through those, can you unlock the higher degrees of theology, medicine, and law. Okay? Now, that's kind of bizarre. You have to go through maths to get to, say, theology. But even in the ancient universities of England, in Oxford and Cambridge, you had to study maths until only a couple of 100 years ago before you could study any other subject. Okay? So that tradition lasted a very long time. But what's missing from it? Well, where does literature fit in? Where do the classical texts I've been going on about fit in? The fact is they don't. The Greek and Roman classics, which are so important to understanding how we are where we are not a major part of the university curriculum, nor the school curriculum, nor indeed monastic life. So the university makes a major difference, but not directly to my story. What is that difference? Well, once the university is there, largely based in a city, and it's an open access institution that anyone can attend. It's not controlled by monastic law, and in fact, it's not entirely controlled by state law. It's an open intellectual space to move into. Well, it's no surprise that when the monastery manifests itself in the middle of a town, literacy increases, a sense of intellectual ambition manifestly increases, and we have a sudden emerging middle class of intellectuals. Not just people going into the law or into the church, but people wanting to learn. Really is a very important moment. And by virtue of that happening, suddenly a public book-selling trade emerges. Because remember, no one was reading books outside of the monastery or outside of the court in the 800s, 900s, 1000s. No one was reading. There was no reason to read. If you went to church, as of course almost everyone did, you were read to. It was a lecture, a lectura, a reading to you. Even in the university system, the reading of books was something very carefully controlled. So just to flesh that out, the idea of a lecture, this is nominally a lecture, and I grant I'm not giving you much chance to say things, but strictly speaking, a lectura is my wheeling out this very expensive book, opening it at the page we've got to, reading it slowly. You all copy down exactly what I read, make your own mini book, and then you annotate your book based upon the words of wisdom I throw towards you. So micro books are being created inside the university. But that can only do so much. And the big breakthrough that comes alongside this is a breakthrough that allows students to buy books when they don't have much money. And this is called a PECIA system, P-E-C-I-A, same word as peace. And the idea is, you're a mere student, you can't afford a book, Max, so unfortunately you can only go down the booksellers and rent a small section. You rent it, you get a professional to copy it, you then give that back and you rent the next bit. So the book is broken down financially for you to rent in installments and thereby build your own library. And that little tweak suddenly sees the growth of personal libraries among intellectuals and among students from the 12th and 13th century onwards. So the universities grow. 1200, we've got 3 or 4 of them. 1300, we've got 18. 1400, we've got 39. And 1500, we've got 73. So sort of doubling each year. And it looks as though the university is going to be the future of the West. But wait, where is Greek in all of this? I've mentioned the Latin tradition at some length, but the Greek tradition is fundamental. Plato, Aristotle, Homer, all of the dramatic poets and playwrights I've mentioned, where are they? And the answer is they crop up in 2 interesting moments, which I have to tell you about for this to be a credible tale. The first is that if we zoom out and look at Greece after the 6th century, it has interaction, both friendly and very much unfriendly, with Arabic-speaking nations. And if we move ourselves to the world of Syria and of Iraq in the 8th century AD, the third caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, is very serious about knowing what's worth knowing. Now, for the most part, that knowledge is not literary. It's not going to help us with the classics, but it's very much about philosophy, about science, and about mathematics. So what happens is, in the 8th century, under Al-Mansur, there's a huge translation project of texts into Arabic, either directly from the Greek, or from the Syriac that came from the Greek, or from the Syriac that came from the Persian that came from the Greek. But either way, we've got a Muslim figure taking seriously the possibility of extracting written knowledge by translation from the Greeks. Well, how does that help the Western world, Western Europe? It helps by virtue of conquest. As you know, the Arabs move along the North African coast, cross into Spain, and from 711 through to 1492, different amounts of the Iberian Peninsula are controlled by Muslims. As such, they're an Arab-speaking set of people whose intellectual and cultural traditions inevitably interact with the Latin-speaking and later vernacular-speaking people who were there before. Okay? And we have within that period, in this Caliphate of Cordoba, Al-Andalus, we have certain figures who are intellectual in terms of their attitude to the tradition of the classics and Greek wisdom. By that I mean someone like Al-Hakam in the 10th century AD. He builds a library and he's adamant about getting Arabic translations of any Greek text he can find. Fast forward a few centuries, both with the Reconquista, the retaking of Spain by Christians, and it just is the case that you have people in Spain who are Christian, who can read Arabic, and who care about Greek knowledge, which means in the 11th and 12th centuries, Greek texts not read by the West for 1,000 years can be read in Latin translation in France, in Italy, in Britain. So, by that circuitous route, which is linked, which combines intellectual curiosity with straightforward conquest, the Greek tradition gets into Europe. And that is why Aristotle comes alive again. You might have heard of scholasticism, this idea that Aristotle and Christianity can somehow be fused. Well, Boethius was trying to do that, but Boethius only translated a few texts of Aristotle, and the current goes dry. But once we have this reinfusion of Aristotle's works, things get going again. And someone like Thomas Aquinas couldn't exist without that particular route. If we get to the 13th century, when Aquinas is alive, there's another way of tapping into the Greek tradition, and that's through the Crusades. We are in a world where the Christians want to retake the Holy Lands and the Levant, And that involves a fair amount of sacking and pillaging as per the course of war. And in 1204, the Fourth Crusade sacks Constantinople, but decides to bring back both texts and people who know Greek. And so we get this big infusion in the 13th century of, again, philosophical, scientific, medicinal, and theological Greek texts that weren't known. Finally, a third installation comes when, in 1453, the Ottomans overtake the Eastern Empire permanently. Mehmet or Mohammed II defeats Constantine XI, and the Byzantine scholars leave with their books for the Latin-speaking West, the Italian peninsula. And as such, they bring not just Greek books, but the ability to teach Greek. So, in this convoluted tale, what I want to close by underlining is that Greek, effectively, has not been informing the Western European tradition for almost 1,000 years. It's very occasional, very elite, very narrow. But when we get to the 14th century, the late 14th century, people are now turning up and saying, I will teach you Greek. Now, this is an essential part of understanding where we are, but to round off today's account, now that we've got to the 15th century, I'm going to say a few words about humanism. Okay, so we've looked at the monasteries, we've looked at the universities, and we've looked at state power. None of those describes the emergence of something called humanism. What is that word? It's a self-styled term that these figures gave to themselves. They said, I am an humanista. I'm not a legista or a jurista. I'm not focused on the world of law. No, I'm about the human. Well, what did that mean? This was a genuinely interesting move away from theological squabbling, philosophical scholasticism, juridical special pleading, and instead diving into a broader artistic culture which allegedly could teach you about being human. And for these people, that meant going back to the Latin and now the Greek classics. And the figure that changed all of this is a 14th century figure called Francesco Petrarca, in English, Petrarch. And if I just say a few words about Petrarch to round off, I hope that may help a little. Petrarch's born in Italy, in Arezzo, but fundamentally, he doesn't go down any of the obvious paths available to him. He could have become a lawyer, he could have become a monk, but no, he stays outside in the open world. He ends up in Avignon, where the papacy is in exile, and he finds a guy who might be able to teach him Greek, and he's so excited. It fails. He says Greek's just too hard, and although he owned a Greek copy of Homer, Petrarch could never read it. But he was so fired up with reconnecting with what he called the classical world, dismissing the medium aevum, the media aetas, this awkward middle bit, which wasn't the true classics, that he devoted himself to creating Latin literature on classical models. To do that, he had to find books. So he toured around the monasteries with his pals and, in slightly dodgy ways, paid off the monks to give him those texts. And he built up a private library that allowed him to reconnect. And there's a really telling moment in a letter he wrote, 1345. He wrote a letter to Cicero. Now, Cicero, as you know, is the orator of the 1st century BC. But in this letter, Petrarch speaks to Cicero not just as a friend, but as a friend that has returned to him. Because Petrarch has rediscovered a manuscript of Cicero's letters that hadn't been read for centuries. He found it surviving in a monastery. He realized that Cicero wasn't this upstanding figure, but actually a bit of a backwards, underhand dealer. And he writes to Cicero to rebuke him whilst praising him. He says, you're a great man, but I've seen what you've done in these private letters. You lecture us about virtue. Well, it's no good, Cicero. And although that might seem a sort of frivolous moment, actually it's crucial. It's a 14th century Italian speaking to a 1st century BC Italian as an equal. And from that point onwards, from Petrarch onwards, things suddenly emerge. In Florence, Coluccio Salutati, Poggio Bracciolini, Niccolo Niccoli, these guys get serious about bringing the wealth of Latin and Greek knowledge into one space for the public. And to close, in the 15th century, if we stay in Florence briefly, money is emerging in big ways in the banking families. This is happening in Germany and in Italy in particular. And in Florence, it's the Medici. The Medici are insanely wealthy. But they also are captivated by this new spirit of humanism, which we call the Renaissance. And so Cosimo de' Medici, in the mid-15th century, pays unimaginable amounts of money to a bookseller called Vespasiano da Bisticci and says, I'll throw all money at it. 45 scribes, I want 200 manuscripts gathered together in a public library at San Marco. This is the first serious public library created in Western Europe for more than 1,000 years. And it starts in Florence and spreads through the various ducal states in the ever-fragmented Italy. And that, in the 15th century, is the moment when the classics look as though they have landed once more. So 2 dates. 1453, the fall of the Eastern Empire at last. But 1450, maybe even 1453, up in Germany, a technology comes that's going to change everything. The birth of the printing press, where a book can be made in 1% of the time than it would take a scribe. And that will be the starting point for the fourth and final account of this journey, where we look into the modern fate of the classics, what effect the dawn of printing had, and what the future looks like for all of us who want the Latin and Greek classics to maintain some cultural valency in our world. So I'll stop there, and thank you.